Hello, everyone. Welcome to the YouTube lecture for Class 7. I created this lecture because I was sick on Thursday and unable to come in. Sorry I wasn't able to meet with you guys, but I didn't want to spend my time just coughing on people. That's not very polite. All right, let's get started. The overview here is that talking about biologic drugs and drug shortages. If we were in class, I would have asked you a number of questions. So this is going to go by much faster than if we were in class. But in general, this was a shorter lecture than the others anyway this week. So biologics. The first thing I want you to think about is what are biologics? Where do they come from? As you know from reading, hopefully you did the reading. You know that these are compounds that come from living organisms, whether they're from multicellular organism like us, and because in fact a number of the biologics are designed around human features and essentially come from us or drugs made from our bodies. Or they come from other types of animals, or they come from single cell organisms like bacteria, uh, maybe in some cases, maybe viruses or inspire or lead to the creation of some biologics. So they come from anything living on this planet that we can find, that we can generate compounds from. And these are not chemicals, so they're not some some small entity that can be replicated by mixing up a few solutions. You actually have to have the biological system around to produce these compounds. So everything you see here is coming from an organism. So in that way, um, the biologics as a type of drug or type of compound that we use for healing um, are very unique, but they are also really dependent on the biological systems that we use to make them. And that really creates the entire host of complications that we have in the regulatory side or on the policy side, is that the fact that they are so hard to make, we're so dependent on the biological systems to create them, that anything going wrong with that system, or if we're unable to somehow get that system to behave in the way we want it to, then we have a host of problems that can arise as a result. And one of those problems is that they're expensive. They cost a lot of money. They range from maybe 20,000 per year to upwards of 200,000 per year, and that's extremely expensive for any type of drug. A number of these drugs are cancer drugs, so think of them as some of the more innovative cancer drugs out there, and they tend to be quite useful. And biologics, as a concept anyway, uh, are really innovative and very useful because if you think about it, the notion of creating drugs that look like our biology or the biology of another organism that might be more similar to us than some of the chemicals that we put in our bodies is an enticing notion. So the idea is that instead of putting something in your body that is not normally there, we're going to try to put something in your body that your body is used to seeing. So something that basically mimics exactly what your body is normally doing, and it just enhances it. Just think, well, if we could create some kind of compound to repair your leg when it was injured. Let's say you broke your leg and we wanted to heal your bone quickly. If we could give you a drug that can mimic what your bone actually does naturally, then that would be great. And that would make a lot of sense instead of using some artificial device to help your leg heal, something that your body doesn't normally have, and so it may respond to it in a negative way. But the problem, of course, is that our body is extremely complex, and uh, yeah, everything we're talking about in public health school, medical school, and other health professional schools is all focus on the complexity of the human body and its human system. So, that gives you some sense of just how complex it is. And clearly, there's so much about the human body that we don't know. We continue to explore. And so, we don't really know quite what we're doing all the time. And even with these compounds, there's always a chance that if we get something wrong, that we can set off, a chain of events in someone's body that could be negative because we're dealing with a very delicate, highly complex system, and small changes mean a lot sometimes. So, the idea of biologics is very enticing, very useful, and you're likely to see a lot of innovation in this area in the future. But it's still so complex, and there's still so much for us to learn. So, that's good and bad. And so, just think about that moving forward. You're going to see more biologics coming from pharmaceutical companies as they're able to create them. So the future market potential is fairly straightforward. The market is growing at about 9.5% per year. So this is a good area for pharmaceutical companies. But because it's so expensive, and again because the systems are so complex, you you basically have high risk, and so of course high risk goes with high reward, but that also means it can be a risky field to be in, and if it doesn't work out, you may have just spent a huge amount of money trying to generate these biologic drugs and just not get anything on return. But when they're working, they work well, and they can be some of the more effective drugs out there because they are mimicking a biological system, and vaccines being obviously some of the more popular among the biologic drugs and some of the well-known ones that we take every year. Now, upon approval, what's the difference between a biologic and a new chemical entity? So we talked before about drug approval, and when we talked about drugs, we were just talking mainly about new chemical entities. So, new types of chemicals that are being created. Most of those chemicals are being created from some existing chemicals, something someone's doing in a lab. They don't have any biological system around. They're not using any animal. They're not using bacteria. They're just using chemicals that come from plants and other sources in nature. Different things that have been put together in certain ways to create a compound that can be put into the human body and actually play some role. That compound um, generally comes into the body for a certain period of time, and then the body washes it out. On the other hand, a biologic may actually assume a role inside of a person's body and maintain that role. For example, a vaccine stimulates the body to do something, and the body maintains that function. So in that way, it's very different from a chemical compound. So what's the difference in the approval process? Do we require anything differently? Is the FDA looking for anything different? What the FDA looks for is something called a biologics license application. So early in the approval of sorry biologics, the steps are very similar. So before you start doing clinical trials, you have to turn in the investigational new drug application that we talked about before, and then you go through your clinical trials. But once you're done and you're ready to actually get approval from FDA to market your biologic, then you have to turn in a biologics license application. And that would be something similar to the new drug application that we talked about before. And in the past, there was never an abbreviated biologics license application. All we had is this route for a brand name. But we're of course going to talk about how the Affordable Care Act is creating an abbreviated pathway for making biologics. So what's different about this biologics license application? Well, the main difference is that it requires a great deal more manufacturing information. So because the process of creating biologics is so complex and so involved, requires so many different steps. The FDA the FDA spends a lot of time focusing on the process of making biologics, and a little less time focused on, well, what is the end product? Because the end product, if you control the biological system and all of the steps to create that end product, the end product should be consistent. So it's really all about what's happening in this process. Whereas for the chemical God, sorry. Whereas for the chemical entity, the key here is, well, can you consistently make that chemical? I don't really care what you're doing. You're just making a chemical, and at the end of the day, I want to make sure that chemical is the same. But here, because the biological system is involved, FDA wants to make sure: are you using a consistent biological system? Do you actually have the ability to get that thing, whatever it is, on a regular basis and get it to behave in a way that's going to yield a product? So they're really concerned much more with manufacturing. So there's a lot more time spent on the manufacturing process early on before someone is going to seek drug approval in the early stages when they're planning to do their early trials. They would spend a lot of time with the FDA in a meeting prior to submitting their investigation new drug application, where they really spend a lot of time talking about the potential for manufacturing this compound in an efficient, consistent way where they're getting raw materials from and so on. So it's just much more focused on the manufacturing side. All right. So the biologics license application is essentially permission from the well, if it's approved, sorry, it's permission from the FDA to place your biologic drug or your biologic product into interstate commerce. So just the idea is that you're being licensed to take that biologic out and sell it to people and for it to enter commerce. Now, one reason this is called something different and it has a slightly different flavor is because of the compound itself. But another reason that's different is because of what you read, is that the biologics have come through a different system from drugs. So biologics have been regulated by the Public Health Service Act, and drugs have been regulated by the Food and Drug Act. So they're in different parts of the Code of Federal Regulations, and they are in different sections because biologics really were they were regulated before drugs, but they were regulated mainly focused on a certain compound, and that compound was vaccines. So the focus on vaccines early on was really making sure that people got the vaccines, right? So it had much more of a public health role than the Food and Drug Act. Food and Drug Act was really focused on safety and effectiveness. People didn't necessarily have to get the drug if they needed it. That's great. Obviously, there are times now when we think that a certain population needs a drug, but we're not really thinking about the entire public when we think about the Food and Drug Act. Food is a little different, but when we think about the drug component, we're not really thinking that everyone's going to need, some particular drug. But for vaccines, we thought that, everyone needed vaccines. We wanted to stop certain infections, smallpox, for example. So we really focus on those biologic compounds. How do we, regulate them in a way that makes them safe, and then it also gets them out to other people. So that's why they were being regulated under or one of the reasons why they're being regulated under the Public Health Service Act. That's much more of a public health aspect to it. All right. And the licensing application is regulated mainly by CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. So CBER. And then there's the other similarly sounding CEDAR, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And they regulate really small biologics. So they tend to not spend much time on biologics. That's not what they focus on. They focus mainly on chemical entities, but they do look at really small proteins that are biologics. And one example is insulin. So there, we do have generic insulin, but we don't have larger molecules, larger biologics that are generic. And we have generic insulin because insulin went through the CEDAR process, and so the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So they already have an abbreviated process that leads to generics, which we talked about before, but the Biologics Evaluation and Research Center does not. So that's the one that everyone's been focused on when they talk about biosimilars or biogenerics. All right. Our focus here is, well, should Congress permit generic biologics? And we know that they have already decided to do so, but there is a discussion beforehand about, well, should they do this? And this really results from this notion of how complex these molecules are, as we talked about before. So, one way to look at these molecules and a nice analogy for them is by looking at different types of transportation. So, aspirin is really small, about 20,000, 20, sorry, 21 atoms, and an antibody, which is a common biologic, is about 25,000 atoms. And you can see the size just from looking at it. One, you can barely see this antibody looks big. In fact, both of these are really small to the human eye, and you wouldn't be able to see either one of them by themselves, but in a solution, of course, you could. Um, Similarly, a bike is really small, 20 pounds. A jet is about 30,000 pounds, right? Well, not only are these things different in just sheer size, but they are different in complexity. So, most of us could probably repair our bike when it breaks down. Most of us actually could go in the lab and actually make aspirin. You could probably be given a set of chemicals, told what to do, how to mix it up, just like you would in the kitchen by cooking, and make some aspirin, right? Just like people make methamphetamine and other drugs without really complex equipment. They don't really need much. On the other hand, you're not going to just whip out or you're not going to just put some things together in a lab and whip up some antibodies. You need a biological system in order to generate those. It's much more complex. These molecules are hard to assemble. A biological system assembles them. People don't make them in the lab by themselves just with a set of chemicals. Same for a jet. You know, you can repair your bike, but repairing a jet takes a lot of expertise. Making a jet, obviously, it takes all kinds of knowledge and equipment and intelligence from a lot of different places. There are all kinds of standards for meeting that you have to meet in order to make the jet appropriately before it can fly privately or publicly through a commercial vendor. So that just gives you some idea of just how complex these molecules are. And so you have some sense of, well, you know, if we're going to create a generic version of this, and just think about who makes jets. There are only a few people who make jets in the world. Same for biologics. There are really only a few companies that can do this well. And and as you know, right now we just have brand name biologics for the large biologics. So uh, these things are really hard to make. And so there were a lot of questions early on about, well, should this even be done? Should we just say, well, we're going to have brand name biologics, and maybe if a better one comes along, that can outcompete the existing brand name biologic. But you know, a generic just doesn't make sense here because no one can really replicate what a biological system is doing unless a company hands over their entire system, right? And a company, of course, would not be willing to do that because it would be a trade secret. Well, despite that, Europe in 2003 developed regulations to create biosimilars, and our country eventually, after a lot of prodding and poking by generic generic drug company lobbyists and patient groups and a number of other people, really got to the point where it realized it needed to create a system for creating biologic generics too. So I mean, it's still not quite there. Unfortunately, here we are in 2013, and the system has not really been completely put in place and utilized, but we're on our way. And so hopefully, once we get there, people will benefit from the creation of biologic generics. So the Affordable Care Act talks about a new pathway for how this is going to be done and how we're going to actually have these biosimilars or biologic generics or follow on biologics. Those are all terms that mean the same thing. They just mean basically a generic form of this compound called a biologic that is typically a brand name. So the abbreviated pathway focuses on two different types of similarities. One is highly similar. Well, I really should say two different ways of describing similarity. One is highly similar, and one is interchangeable. So these standards are similar, but one is greater than the other. So highly similar um, is it has one meaning, interchangeable has another. So highly similar means essentially you only have really minor differences, and that the differences are actually in the clinically inactive part of the drug. They're not in the clinically active part of the drug. So the drug essentially does the same thing, and there are some minor differences in it. One of your classmates, another class, mentioned that he had read that the differences could be up to 20%. Well, that may be true, but that's really a average generic number. It really depends on the compound, right? So you really have to take these biologics on a case by case basis. And so when the FDA is looking at them, depending on the actual structure of the molecule and how much the variation matters, it may be 20%, maybe 10%, who knows? It will vary depending on what they're actually reviewing. But highly similar, looking really close. Um, you know, this would be like if you wanted if you owned a Mercedes and someone said, "Well, let me get you a car that's highly similar to that." If I, let's say someone wrecks your Mercedes and they're like, "Well, I'm gonna get you a car that's highly similar," and so they might get you a Lexus, right? On the other hand, they might say, "Well, I'm gonna get you a car that's interchangeable with your car," and that means you really should have a hard time telling the difference, right? In fact, it should come back maybe looking a little better since they wrecked your car, right? So interchangeable is essentially the same thing, right? Now, again, some minor differences would be allowed, but interchangeable really refers to the notion that if you start with one drug, the brand name biologics, you should be able to come in and replace it with that generic biologic and have no difference in clinical result, right? So no additional side effects that no one that you weren't having with the brand name, uh, no problems with effectiveness that you were not having with the brand name. It should be the same thing, just like we expect for new chemical entities. So on the chemical side, we look for bioequivalence. We look for the same thing because we know that people can make the same chemical. On the biologic side, it can't be the exact same. It can be equivalent because that really just doesn't make sense. I mean, unless you are actually using a company's this exact same procedure as another company, it's gonna be hard to have bioequivalence. But we should be able to get interchangeable. So the definitely the active component of the molecule should be the same. There should be very little difference in the clinically inactive parts of the molecule. So the parts that really are not having the main function, they shouldn't vary that much if it's interchangeable. And a pharmacist should actually be able to switch to that generic biologic without calling a doctor. That's how similar it should be. It should be interchangeable. All right. So when the FDA is looking to review interchangeable drugs, they're looking for the same clinical result. They're looking for this idea that there can be a seamless transition between one and the other. So they're really just trying to lay out like this is a higher standard than highly similar. Okay. So what do you get if you create a biologic? I'm sorry, I should say the Affordable Care Act also adjusted the amount of exclusivity, sorry, that companies that produce brand name biologics create can receive. So prior to prior to the Affordable Care Act, manufacturers of biologics who created a brand name biologic, of course, um, would receive the same amount of exclusivity, market exclusivity, that other companies that produce any other chemical drug will receive. So 5 years, what we talked about before. If they produce an orphan drug, they would get 7 years. But after the Affordable Care Act, on the basis of a lot of good lobbying by these companies, they now get 12 years. 12 years, that's right. So from 5 to 12 years, 7 additional years they tacked on to market exclusivity. Um, and they get 4 years of data exclusivity. So, data exclusivity refers to the time period during which a generic company cannot submit an application using the data that the brand name company created. All right. So let me just give you a scenario. So imagine that you are a generic company making a biologic, and you say, well, um, this year, or you may say yesterday, um, brand name company X created a new biologic. We want to make that same biologic, but we're not exactly quite sure how to make it, but we have some idea. And we're going to get started on our process to make it. And we want to submit our application for making a generic biologic as soon as we can. So you cannot submit that application until 4 years after the data exclusivity runs out. And why is that? It's because you want to use the data from the brand name company's trials, right? So remember, generic companies do not want to spend a lot of time doing clinical trials. If they do, then they should just be making a brand name drug, right? Because they're spending all that money to do the clinical trials over. So it makes no sense to do that and come up with a generic drug that's going to face competition from a lot of other companies. So what they want to do is get the data that the brand name company has that they've developed through their clinical trials and all their R&D, and they want to use that when they submit their generic application. And FDA allows you to do that, but they give you create a certain amount of years that you have to wait until you can do that. So in this case, you have to wait 4 years before you can get to that information. After that fourth year, bam, you can bring in the information of the brand name company. The FDA has all that information. You can rely on it, and you can utilize that to support your application. Um, Now, you cannot actually get your application approved until another 8 years later when the market exclusivity runs out. So remember, the brand name company now gets 12 years of market exclusivity. So that's 12 years that they're allowed to market their drug without any competition. And so you might say, man, that's crazy. 12 years, right? First of all, it's a good business model. If you have an idea for creating a biologic drug, that's a great place to go for a business because you get a monopoly essentially for 12 years. Who gets a monopoly for 12 years and on anything really in any industry? And remember, this is not your patent. So you can have a patent for 20 years. Your patent can be on the verge of running out, and right as your patent is close to running out, you may get FDA approval, and now you essentially get a new life, right? For 12 years, now you'll get exclusivity. So one of the reasons that companies fall so hard to get so much exclusivity for these biologic drugs is because, for one, it's a highly innovative area of research, but it's really expensive and it's hard to get products that work. So they're essentially they were essentially telling Congress that if you want us to spend time focusing on this area, which seems extremely promising, but is highly expensive and prohibitive and is full of risk, then we're going to need a big carrot at the end, right? So the big carrot is more exclusivity because that means you have more of a monopoly and a chance to make a ton of cash on these drugs, right? Remember, these drugs are not cheap. Now, what did Congress get out of that? Well, Congress said, well, as a result, we want a generic process, right? We want FDA to be able to create a regulatory process for abbreviating the applications that can be put in. So we want generic companies to be able to come in at some point and make generics to do what? To lower our costs and lower the costs for the public. So costs will be lowered, but it will take a while before costs can be lowered because you have to wait on this long period of exclusivity that the biologic brand name companies can have. Now, there's also some exclusivity, some market exclusivity for generics. When does that happen? And that was in your reading. So, biologic generics can get 1 year of exclusivity if they prove that their generic drug is interchangeable. So remember, we talked about highly similar and interchangeable as being standards for this abbreviated approval pathway. So if you can show that your generic drug is interchangeable, so the pharmacist could just swap it out, it would have the exact same clinical result, then in that case, you would get 1 year of exclusivity. And that only goes to the first generic company that can do that. So basically, Congress and FDA in this case would be trying to create an incentive for generic companies to not just make a highly similar version of the biologic, but to make the exact same thing. And what's the incentive? Well, the incentive is all the money you can make for having 1 year of market exclusivity. All right. So you can get that. You can come in and get something that rarely goes to generic companies, and that's exclusivity. So you get to block out all the other generic competition for 1 year, which means you can keep your product higher in price. You're still going to make it lower than a brand name company. Let's say you may bring it down 10%, 20%, but you're not going to drop it substantially by half, for example, because you have no competition, right? So you may argue against that rule. You may say, well, that makes no sense. We don't do that for other generics. But in order to incentivize these companies to make a compound that's interchangeable, uh, Congress felt there was a need to offer them something in return. And so that's what they get in return. All right. Okay. But you can really, you should spend some time thinking about, well, is 12 years too much or not? And how much exclusivity should be given to these companies? Should it change over time? Should we do something other than exclusivity? Is that the only way to go? Is there some other way to reward them for the creation of this product? Maybe just paying them their R&D costs or something. But there are a lot of potential ways you can go about this. But right now, exclusivity is the main thing that we use to incentivize industry to get into a particular market. Now, that probably means also that some companies that weren't in the biologics market are now really giving some serious thought to it. And that's what we want, right? We want to see more innovation here because we really think we've kind of capped out on the chemical drug side and that we're really running out of options and not seeing much innovation there. So we really want to stimulate the innovation on the biologic side because that looks like where a lot of the new drugs are going to come from. All right, now the challenges for FDA. Well, one challenge is really trying to figure out whether or not these products are highly similar or interchangeable. There are some people in the industry who don't believe FDA can actually do it. They have not done it before, so other than the smaller molecules, but for these larger molecules, it's going to be complex and it's going to be difficult. Um, FDA is going to have to spend a lot more time interacting with these generic companies than they do with the typical generic companies because of all the manufacturing challenges they face. So that'll be slightly different for FDA. In fact, the FDA has stated that user fees, and these companies will have to pay user fees, just like the other drug companies have to pay for the drug approval process. The user fees, according to the FDA, are not going to actually be that different on the generic side compared to the brand name side. So that's a little weird, right? So that means there are going to be costs for the generic company that they typically don't see on the generic drug side. So if you want to get into the generic biologics business, you've got to have more capital, um, and that should be clear to you. Also, because the process for creating these drugs is so complex, we're likely to not see as much of a drop in the price of the drugs as we see with chemical entities. All right, and here's a link here where you can see Europe's progress towards biosimilars. Europe is is ahead of us on this one. As I said before, they created regulations before we did. They've actually already approved 14 biosimilars. So they really are, destroying the U.S. in terms of our ability to compete with them on this, and we're really learning from them on us and on this issue. And when you go to meetings, I've been in a few meetings on this issue, and they are definitely quick to say that they are out ahead of us and that we need to learn from them. All right, so Europeans have seen the price drop about 10 to 35%. So that's really nothing compared to what we see on a chemical drug side. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, why is that? It's because the process is much more complex, right? So for the brand name chemical drug companies, the price they're charging is really just a brand name price, right? They're really just well, I wouldn't say they're gouging people. They're really just making profit. Once they are able to get the drug approved, and once they finish all their R&D, everything beyond that point, it's really just a cash business. They're getting lots of money in for the manufacturing process they're doing. The manufacturing is not that hard, given the amount they're charging per pill. right? And that's why they're able to offer some of those deals we've talked about in the past classes because they don't have to spend that much money manufacturing these drugs. And there may be certain situations for certain types of drugs that have some raw materials that are hard to get and so on, but typically that's not the case. So as a result, the price drop is usually quite substantial when the generics come in because they basically just get rid of the brand side of it. They don't mark up based on brand, but they're still marking their products up, and their markup is still enough for them to run their businesses and make plenty of money. And they drop the price by 80%. So that gives you some sense of just how much money the brand name chemical drug companies are making. On the other hand, on the biologic side, the process is so expensive and so complex that they really are not able to drop the price that much at all. Now, this European price drop did not take into account all the various types of rebates that are out there. So, you may think in the U.S., if we're talking about the military, they're going to get a better deal. They can probably bring the price down by 50%. But typically, they bring it down much more, right? 80 to 90% probably. So, on the consumer side, we may be able to bring it down, 45% or 50%, depending on how well a PBM can negotiate for us, right? Or Medicaid, they may be able to bring the price down, depending on how well the Medicaid program can negotiate and what kind of rebates they can get, right? So we can get the price down, probably a little lower than it's 10 to 35%. But remember, uh, just the process is so complex that we won't be able to get it down as much as the generic chemical entities. All right, now there are another challenge that arises for FDA is that there are shortages of these biologic drugs. And again, this goes back to the complexity of the process for creating these drugs. So, because they are so hard to make, there are times when the biological system is not functioning the way we want it to. So, as a result, we end up with a shortage of the drug. Right? We don't know. Let's say, for example, you depending on a bacteria, and the bacteria mutates in some way. So now it's not producing this compound that you thought it was producing because the bacteria has become slightly different itself, right? So you can imagine there have to be a lot of quality control checks for the manufacturing of these drugs, and there are. There are a lot of efforts to prevent other types of biological entities from entering the system. For example, if you're working with microorganisms, working with bacteria, then you got to make sure people don't come in there with a really bad pneumonia or something, coughing on the products and stuff like that. So you got people just don't mess the whole system up, and all kinds of ways that people can do things to just mess up the purity of the drug that you're trying to create. All right. One more thing I wanted to point out to you is that there's also an additional market exclusivity given for pediatric biologic studies. So if you do some pediatric clinical studies and you're at the end of your exclusivity, then you can get an additional 6 months, for example. So you can extend your exclusivity with pediatric data. So that again is an incentive to generate pediatric data. 6 months is a lot of money. Remember, some of these companies make um, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in 1 month. So each month is meaningful for their shareholders. So they definitely work to generate that pediatric data when they can to participate in the trials. All right, here's just another example of kind of how these drugs are different. The small one on the left hand side is aspirin. Um, the large one is an antibody, and it's just showing you just how small in scale aspirin is in comparison. So it just shows you how complex these drugs are. All right, drug shortages. So shortages are all about the supply chain. So back to this diagram that we talked about before, where we pointed out, well, here are the various players in the drug supply chain. Before I put up the PBMs here on the side. In this case, the PBMs don't matter so much. They don't usually generate shortages. They're not really the source of shortages. Perhaps they could be if they, for some reason they decided that some compound that consumers depended on, had a therapeutic equivalent that they weren't willing to put on a formulary, that could potentially lead to a shortage. But usually there's a therapeutic equivalent, right? So you have something else, you have an alternative you can go to, so they don't really create shortages that often. But these other players do. The biggest one, of course, being a manufacturer. They create shortages, and the people before them who are not on the supply chain, but who were on another diagram I showed you in a prior class, the raw material people, right? So the raw materials are really essential and important when it comes to drug shortages. And a lot of drug shortages that exist today, even for some basic compounds. I've talked to some residents and attending docs about this, and they talk about some basic compounds in the hospital they can't get because of raw material shortages. And so this is not something that's sort of far fetched. It's something that's really hitting Americans quite a bit. A number of people are going without drugs that they depend on because of shortages, and a number of those shortages are tied to things that are outside of what we consider to be our main supply chain here. And that's because 80% of the raw materials come from outside the U.S., as you saw in your reading. So, given that dependency we have on the rest of the world, kind of like oil, right? We can end up with shortages. Our prices can vary and so on, based on the existence or availability of raw materials. All right. So here's a graph just showing you how shortages are increasing. There's some up and down from 2003 to 2006, and then they just sort of shot up. You might ask, well, why did they shoot up? Well, they shot up mainly because companies started realizing that certain compounds were not generating enough income for them and did not fit their business model. And what you have to realize is that the drugs we get are not public goods. And so a number of people think of their drugs as being theirs, like they belong to them. Like, oh, I have to take my whatever, my insulin, my this, my that. And they sort of think, well, it's always going to be around. Whenever I need it, I go pay for it and so on. But there is no guarantee that a drug has to be available for you. You know, it's like going to Costco or Walmart or something else. You may really like a certain brand of cereal that they stock, but there is no reason they ever have to stock that, and there's no reason that the manufacturer ever has to make that again. They can stop making it tomorrow, and you can never see Cheerios again for the rest of your life because the manufacturer doesn't want to make Cheerios. Somebody else might make something similar, but they're not going to make Cheerios. They just stop doing it, right? So no one can force these private companies to make anything. So, despite the needs that society might have that are related to these drugs, manufacturers do not have to make any of these drugs. And that's a really important point to make. FDA cannot make them manufacture any drug. FDA doesn't have that authority. Congress uh, probably would not do this. Perhaps in a very dire situation, they might push the manufacturer to make this, but this would be in some extreme natural disaster situation, and the manufacturer would probably be willing to help. But in general, Congress is not going to force any business to make anything. All right, these are private sector businesses. This is not a socialist country. You cannot force a company to make any certain type of good. That's not a public good, right? On the other hand, you know, for utilities, which is essentially like a public good, uh, governments have a little more, you know, interaction with utility companies where they sort of push them to do things. Look, you need to expand electricity out to this rural area or something like that. That's slightly different. And definitely when something's a public good like the military or FEMA, that kind of thing, we can determine that, you know, people can get access to these services, the money and so on. So, but remember, this is not a public good, not a public service. This is we're completely dependent on private companies. That means at any given time they could stop making drugs that people live off of. All right, that's what we're going to realize. Okay, so so what are drug shortages? There's essentially a mismatch between supply and demand. So basic old economics here. There's a huge amount of demand, but there's no supply, so you've got a shortage, right? And typically, what you see in other sectors is you see companies come in, right? When you have great demand anywhere, usually that's a sign for some company to come in and make whatever it is and give it to people. You might ask, why doesn't that just naturally happen on the drug side? Why do we end up with these shortages? Well, some of it's because the source of the shortages is difficult to overcome, right? So if it's a raw material shortage, well, if that material only comes from like a couple of countries in the world and they're having some civil conflict and you just can't get that material, then it doesn't matter what company you are, you're not going to be able to get that material. You're not going to be able to make that drug, right? So that could be a really basic problem that might exist. Also, the complexities of getting drugs paid for in our healthcare quote unquote system can prevent many companies from wanting to make certain drugs because the business model might not be there. So after they create that drug and they try to sell it for a price that seems reasonable to them, and especially if it's a generic drug, um, they may go through so many steps of negotiating that their profit margin is just getting sucked out of them, and it just doesn't make sense to be in that business when they could be making some brand name drug and getting much more money, right? So the alternatives are better, right? So that could be a situation where demand, despite all the demand that's there, you don't have supply. You don't have companies coming in and doing this. And remember, not anyone can just come along and make a drug, or you can't just come along easily and become a pharmaceutical company. So if you want to if we want people to if we want companies have not been making certain drugs to shift over and make a new drug, they're usually going to be an existing pharmaceutical company, right? They're not going to be just some completely new player that no one's ever seen before. That just doesn't happen that often. So so that's some of the complexities there, and that's some of the reasons why we don't see this market behaving like we see a typical market behave. For example, there was a huge demand for shirts, and some companies stopped making them. People would just step in their place, like Filene's Basement disappeared, right? And you had other companies step right in. I'm sure a lot of women didn't even feel Filene's missing. They may have briefly felt it, but after a couple of months, it really didn't seem like it was a big deal because there are all these other places that could offer clothing and replace Filene's. All right. So when we think about shortages from an FDA standpoint, we can't have an alternative manufacturer available. Otherwise, it's not really a shortage. If somebody out there can make the drug, it's not a true shortage from the FDA's perspective. It's just, one manufacturer is causing a decline in the availability of the drug, but another one can meet the demand. Okay, and also it needs to be a medically necessary drug. So if there really is no medical need because there are other substitutes like 10 other things you can take for your illness, then the FDA doesn't consider that to be a shortage. So this is FDA's definition of a shortage. This is not the definition that's used by certain health providers. So certain health providers may define a shortage based on their own individual local needs, and those may not match the national scene at all. So that may have something to do with the way they manage their inventory, how much they want to pay for a drug, and all kinds of other things. Maybe the wholesaler they're using, and that kind of thing. That may not be impacting providers nationally, and may not be something the FDA really cares much about. But locally, you could be experiencing shortages on a regular basis, and it might impact patients, but it might actually not be a national shortage. But just realize there are other types of shortages out there that are not viewed by the FDA as a shortage. All right, here's a link where you can hear more about farmers' view of shortages. Obviously, I'm not going to play that here, um, but they basically are telling people what they think shortages are, where they think shortages are coming from, and how they are trying to play a role in stopping the existence of drug shortages. So, what types of drugs are affected? All types of drugs. The impact on quality of care, well, you can just imagine this definitely harms quality of care. People um, don't get the treatment they typically need. People might end up using expired drugs, which might raise some safety problems. There could be some side effects because people have to switch to a different drug that they weren't using that may have had less side effects, on and on. There was a survey done of oncologists, clinical oncologists, that pointed out that 40% of them um, indicated that a drug shortage had hastened the death of some of their patients. So the point here is that these drugs, the lack of drugs for certain conditions, actually does lead to an early death for certain people. Just imagine someone on a terminal illness and they had a set of drugs for their chemotherapy, and one is taken away because of a shortage. But typically, that cocktail is very effective at prolonging life for another 2 years. But now you take one of the drugs out of the cocktail, and they just last for a year instead of 2 years. So, that could happen, right? Just all due to a shortage. So, these things are not a joke. People are harmed as a result, and they're very serious. And they're a huge challenge for our nation and other nations. Now, frankly, other nations have dealt with shortages much more and much more commonly than the U.S. So this is a bit shocking for a lot of people in the U.S. And we're not used to having a shortage of much of anything, and so you see a lot of media reports on drug shortages in the U.S. because they really do shock the conscience here. They kind of are met with sort of a strong gut reaction here, like how could that ever happen in the U.S. and that kind of thing, because people are just not used to this. So drug shortages lead to rationing. Rationing is something that people in the U.S. usually use to describe other healthcare systems, not ours, even though we have our own form of rationing based on income, which is sort of obvious to all you guys. But rationing is something we think or see or feel typically, and this is one of those instances, unfortunately, where we are feeling rationing. All right, what are the causes? There are a huge number of causes out there. Manufacturing challenges are first and foremost among the causes, and that could be delays in making certain types of drugs because equipment broke down, or that could be the result of the FDA coming in and telling someone to shut down manufacturing because of some quality problem they're having in making something. It could be all kinds of problems that could arise in the manufacturing process. Sorry. As I said before, the raw materials can be limited for whatever reason, conflict and all kinds of things. A lot of the best raw materials, as you know, come from places that also have some of the most conflict, and that's probably not a mistake because people often fight over resources, and that's been happening for centuries. So that's probably unlikely to go away as a challenge. So there's an underlying challenge of making drugs and lots of other types of compounds. Um, there are business decisions that may lead to drug shortages. So if a company just decides that the business model is not good enough, they might discontinue drugs, just stop making it completely because they see no reason to make it given the profit margin they have on other compounds. And again, like I said, you can't force them to make it. So that can happen. Now, what are our policy responses? Well, the president has issued an executive order focused on this. That happened October 31st of 2011. The executive order, sorry, the executive order focused on earlier reporting by manufacturers, trying to make sure that the FDA offered expedited regulatory review for any manufacturers who are trying to help in the drug shortage. And sometimes they have regulatory issues they have to deal with before they can market a drug, and the FDA basically tries to speed up the process for them. Also, the executive order is allowing federal government to spend more time investigating the behavior of market participants. So, one concern is whether or not certain drug companies may be actually stockpiling drugs and creating shortages artificially. So, sinister things do happen, as we talked about in this class. So, you have to look out for those things too. Now, the FDA has a number of different things that it can do to try to address shortages. And one is where I just talked about is expedited review for those manufacturers who decide that they are going to be an alternative manufacturer. They're going to step in and make a drug that is in shortage, so they could do that. Um, the FDA, sorry, the FDA can also look for foreign manufacturers that might make a drug if they can't find a manufacturer here in the U.S. So they can go out there and just try to figure out who's available. They'll look in the U.S. for manufacturers. If they can't find one here, they could go abroad. They could lower restrictions on importing drugs if necessary. They could allow drugs that are expired to continue to be in circulation. In fact, one of the pharmacists in the class pointed out that for some drug, I don't remember the name of the drug right now, but there was one drug where FDA basically told um, providers to just simply write a new expiration date on the existing drug. So that seems a little crazy and ad hoc, but sometimes you have to do things like that in shortage situations. So just change the date by a year, even though the drug had already expired. So the FDA basically has to do an investigation to make sure that certain drugs are maintain their activity. And as some of you already know, I'm sure there are a number of drugs that have an expiration date that is months or perhaps a year or more before the drug truly expires and truly loses its activity completely. That's sometimes the expiration dates are just an ideal period of time for you to get rid of it, but they're not set in stone. There's often a period beyond the expiration date that you can keep drugs. Uh, but of course, it's not to your advantage to do so. But in a shortage condition, you may have to. All right. Um, Now, the FDA, you may wonder why. How does the FDA find out about shortages, right? Well, the FDA finds out about shortages mainly from manufacturers. They can also find out from providers too. Providers can actually just send them an email. Even people can actually send them an email at drug shortages at FDA, h.hhs.gov. But they really do depend on the manufacturers, and that's one of the unfortunate aspects of this process. But it's probably the best way to go, right? Because they are usually the source of the shortage. They can usually see what's going on the supply side because they really are the creators of the compound. So they know if they're having some problem with the machine or something is going to happen along with their raw materials, or something's happening internally within the company that's going to lead to uh, a drug not being made anymore, or so on. Especially discontinuing drugs. So if they're going to discontinue a drug, they know they're going to do that. Let's say, for example, a company decides to merge with another company. So they know in that merging process that as they go through their merger, they're going to learn that, well, certain drugs are going to be the focus of the new company that forms from the merger. And certain drugs are not. Usually, a company's going to focus on their most profitable drugs after their merger, right? And they may get rid of some drugs that have a 1 or 2% profit margin. It may just not be worth their time, right? And that's fine. That makes sense. That's the private sector. We depend on the private sector to make these drugs. So as a result, then we may lose that drug and it may be discontinued. So all they need to let FDA know is that they're considering discontinuing these drugs up front. So the FDA can say, well, what's going to be the impact? Is this medically necessary or not? Is this a shortage that matters? They can figure that out, and they can start informing providers, so providers can gear up and be prepared. And so even if there's not a shortage, at least people are kind of now in gear and ready. And if there is one, then they know to move forward and implement appropriately. But the manufacturers really play a key role here, and you know, to the degree they really care about shortages not harming people, and they should, because some of their own relatives might be harmed. Then they really got to do a better job stepping up to the plate early on and letting FDA know what's going on. So um, uh, the FDA, as a result of the new Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, that looks like FDASIA, that's what I've been calling it. Um, as a result of that act, it passed last year, uh, July of last year. Um, the FDA now requires manufacturers to inform them of a potential shortage. This includes generic and biologic manufacturers, so they all have to tell the FDA what's going on. If they don't, they can get a non-compliance letter, well, the letters don't really mean a whole lot if you can't somehow punish them. I haven't seen any fines or anything like that. So there's not a lot of enforcement, but there really is a strong suggestion, and there is a requirement there that they do this. So it could perhaps put them in, you know, uh, a bad light, I guess, with the FDA if they don't do this, and then a shortage arises that they could have informed the FDA of, which ends up hurting people. So it's to their benefit, especially if they're producing something like a chemotherapy drug that people really need. That even if you got 10,000 people taking it, and that may not seem like a lot for their the amount of money they want to make. Still, that's a lot of people, and if the drug is very useful, even if it's a generic and they don't want to make it anymore, then they got to let people know that they're going to pull out of that business. If they're the main manufacturer of the drug, or they have, like, 60% of the market, and they know they're going to cause a shortage if they pull out. So these companies are strongly incentivized to do this, but they may or may not do it, and it's really up to them because the enforcement mechanisms are really not that strong. All right, so that's biologics, and drug shortages. And if you have any questions, just email me, or we can talk about them next Thursday in class. Okay, thank you.